Greetings, everybody. We are here today to talk about fact or falsehood, or how about false or facthood. I'm Steve Clemens. I'm Washington editor-at-large at The Atlantic. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's session on the consequences of misinformation and what all we should do about it. Let me tell you who our panel is. Just to my left, Nicholas Enfield is Professor of Linguistics at the University of Sydney and Director of the Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Center. I've just spent much of the afternoon reading much of what he's written about this very subject, so I would just say just Google him and you'll find lots about that. And we have Ahmed El-Magharamid, is Executive Director of the Qatar Computing Research Institute, has also written and talked about how AI can be brought to bear with regards to managing our way forward on truth and falsehood and distinguishing between them. And we have Alan Gresh, is the Publication Director of Orient 21, and of course is was the longtime editor and chief of Le Monde Diplomatique. And it's a real pleasure to have Alan here, an old friend. And then Michael Rich, who's president of CEO of the RAND Corporation. So we're going to have a conversation here, but I very much want to involve all of you, and we're going to leave a good amount of time at the end to have questions and exchange with it. But let me start with Michael. Michael and Jennifer Kavanaugh wrote a book called Truth, Decay, an initial exploration of the diminishing role of facts and analysis in American public life. Now, I met Michael in Australia a while back ago, and I thought, Truth, Decay, how cute, because, I walked around telling people I was going to do the Truth, Decay panel, and people hear it as tooth decay. So very clever marketing device here. Barack Obama tweeted this out as one of the books that he was reading recently and found most interesting. And it also recently won, and you're going to have to explain this to me, Michael, the top altmetric book of 2018. In terms of, at least as I read it, in the public policy field, this has come out as number one. An interesting, RAND Corporation has 4 of the top 20 books. Now, is altmetric, am I right, is that what altmetric is? It's basically looking at the fields in public policy coming from policy institutions.
Yeah, it's a bibliometric system that measures the attention through traditional media, academic citations, and importantly now, social media.
So why don't you share with us your dashboard of thinking about truth decay and what it actually means in the context of what you've shared with us in your book?
Well, first, let me say something about the title, since you mentioned that. We're not really talking about truth. I learned as I was doing this research that there's a voluminous literature on the nature of truth, whether there's absolute truth, whether truth can be known. I'm not qualified to enter into that debate. We're really here referring to verifiable facts and accepted conclusions from analytical research. That's what we mean by truth here. And the purpose of the word decay is the description of a process, because I feel that if we're going to make success turning back the situation, we're going to have to understand how it evolved. So truth decay refers to 4 trends, and I'll tick them off briefly. First, the declining agreement about accepted facts and sort of settled conclusions from analytical research. We have a number of examples in the book, but just to give you one, over the last 20 years or so, the science about the safety and benefits of childhood vaccines has gotten stronger. But public support or belief in the safety of the vaccines has declined over that same period of time. There are many other examples. The second trend is a blurring of the line between fact and opinion. You can see this obviously on television, cable television, where all news programs are certainly not all news. They're a mix of news and opinion. You can see it in newspapers that blend, juxtapose reporting and stories that have interpretation alongside each other. And you can see it in a career of a journalist, where journalists now report, but they also blog and tweet and opine and so on. The third trend is a explosion in the volume, and therefore we think the influence of opinion relative to fact. So when I was growing up in the United States, news occupied 1 hour of the schedule on television each day. When it expanded to 24 hours, believe me, there wasn't a 24-fold increase in the amount of reportable facts. So most of what we have now is opinions or repetition of opinions, or even worse, opinions about opinions. And the final trend is a sharp and sustained decline in public trust in institutions, especially institutions that at one time were authorities when it came to facts and accuracy. The combination of those things is what we refer to as truth decay.
But let me just ask you a quick question about that in terms of our case in the United States. And I don't want to make this US-centric, but I do want to raise something that was in my mind when I was both looking at your book and asking how we deal with this question today. Let's take history as an example. And I like how you said we're not looking for truth per se, we're sort of negotiating it. If you take history, in our country, in the United States, the State Department publishes volumes called the Foreign Relations Volumes of the United States, or the Foreign Policy of the United States. And every 25 years, these volumes are published because they try and reconcile classified data and history and what happened with the reality of what happened. So in other words, we are living through periods of time where there's historic denial that is promulgated in a society, and 25 years later, the truth supposedly is brought back and woven back. I remember sitting at one of the releases of these volumes with Richard Holbrooke, the late Richard Holbrooke, when the Vietnam volumes were released, and many of the, I have to say, fairly outrageous things that the United States did and covered up were finally brought back. There's another famous example where a man named Michael Schaller, a scholar from the Arizona State University, was on an academic review committee of one of the publications of these volumes, and it had to do with Japan. And he believed that we were still not reconciling history, and so he actually said that those volumes should publish white papers only, with blank papers, no type at all, because otherwise to say that they were truth would continue the lie of this. And this comes to some things, Nick, you have talked a little bit about, just in terms of negotiating truth and reality and getting there. And so I'm just wondering whether or not this problem or this challenge of negotiating truth has been something we've been living with for a long time historically. But you want to respond to that, Nick?
Yeah, well, negotiating truth is it's an interesting way of putting it. I agree with Michael that there's an issue around truth versus reality versus verifiable facts. What's interesting is that with language, which we really depend on, you're always having to choose a way of describing what happened. You're always having to leave out some information, put in other information. There's always some sort of selectivity. You would never, be able to actually make a statement if you weren't being selective in some way. So, there are many different versions of events which are equally true. The question becomes,
That's what President Trump says, lots of different versions of truth.
There's two. One says, we can have different facts, and of course we ridicule that because...
Alternative facts.
Yeah, because that implies that something can be both true and false at the same time, or two contradictory things can both be true, which is not possible. But what I'm referring to is the fact that, no matter what you do, even if you're describing a very mundane scene, you're being selective in some way or another. You're deciding what is the most important thing to focus on here, and that's basically a property of human language, which is the most fundamental sort of set of tools we're using to talk about truth and to write about truth.
I mean, Alan, for as long as I've known you and have seen Le Monde Diplomatique and all of your activity, you've been poking holes at official statements and looking at cover-ups and providing alternative views. I'll come back to you in the same question and then ask Ahmed and Michael as well. Have we not been living basically the problem of misinformation for as long as any of us have been around?
It's not only misinformation. If you look, for example, the relation of France with its colonial history, it is changing. The view we have today is very different.
So the view of France's colonial history?
The view of French colonial history and the importance in the French history of this. And till now, you have a debate inside the society how to deal with this history. It's not only truth or facts or more or less we know all the facts, but we came back with a different view. In the United States, it's the same thing. 50 years ago, the view the United States has about the black question or about Indians was very different than one today. It's not only the question of truth, it's also a question of point of view. I was speaking, I mean, as you know, I'm working quite a lot on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And I wonder many times, what are facts? I mean, if we speak about what's happening in the conflict, there are thousands of books of history with facts, etc., and still different, fundamentally different point of view. And you can explain it. For example, for Westerner, the Zionism and the installation of Jews of Palestine was a positive, positive thing. For most of the Arab world, it's not. And the way you look at the conflict today, it linked in some way with this. So it's not only the fact, truth or not. Sometimes there are lies, etc. But it's also the question of point of view. And now the fact that 50 years ago, most of the information came from the West. And now you have many more centers of information. You have Russia, China, Jazeera, Middle East, etc., etc. And it's very difficult sometimes to reconcile what is important for us is not important in the Arab world.
So just before I leave you, is that chaos of news flow healthier or less healthy?
I think it's healthier in some way, in the fact that it's not only one point of view, and I don't think we will ever reach a stage where all the world will agree on all the questions. I mean, it's normal. We have different history, we have different culture. We cannot look at the conflict in the same way. Of course, we could perhaps reconcile, we could discuss, and I think the fact that there are different opinions is important. For me, the question of the media is pluralism. It's not to say that we have one objective position, it's to say on the French international field, we have different points of view which are debating, confronting, making polemics. This is healthy for the news and for democracy also.
So Ahmed, let me, I'm going to frustrate Alan here, because if you listen to Alan for a minute, it's my colleagues, it all sounds pretty innocent, it's just lots of different views and healthy, but let's just say it's turbocharged news pluralism with computers behind it and algorithms, and to kind of come into your world of you know, really next generation computational abilities and processing abilities that exist behind Twitter and Facebook and lots of other places that are moving this. So does the innocence of what Alan just talked about continue to be innocent in a world where you can create incredible news spikes, or a minority group with one of those contending views can hijack you know, the passions of a system? So I'd love to get your, you know, where computing power and the digital age come into this question.
Sure, sure. So many of you must have seen the movie The Minority Report.
Oh yeah.
So and the idea,
Tom Cruise,
yeah,
doesn't end up very good for him.
You know, but
Yeah.
the idea in The Minority Report is that the authorities would know about a crime before you commit the crime, and our approach to solving this problem, or approach to tackling this problem in our institute, is to try to figure out fake news before it gets written. So in fact, instead of trying to fact check the news itself, we focus on the sources. So we've developed a number of aggregators, news aggregators, and then we rank the various media based on biases, whether right bias, left bias, centrist, and so on and so forth. And we try to provide this information so that you develop an opinion on these news.
So how does Peninsula News come out? You know, your local
I'll have
paper.
to. I'll give you the Tanbih website. And it's the system is called Tanbih. We've actually developed a number of news aggregators called Live News, Propi, and so on and so forth. And they focus on factuality of reporting, biases, propaganda, and so on and so forth. So we're trying to take this approach to it. And then we also have developed a fact checker called ClaimRank that you could send. basically, by monitoring the news, it would tell you what are the things that you ought to fact check. So if you send to it a report, it would tell you this part ought to be fact checked because this is sort of something.
So give us an example. Say you have Le Monde Diplomatique in there, and they've got a great front page article. How would Le Monde Diplomatique come in terms of processing their publication?
So if you go to the Tanbih portal, and there is, we have pre-processed a large number of sources, whether it's
Right.
NBC or Fox News or Wall Street Journal and so on and so forth. And for those, you get an explanation of where they stand, their biases, and so on and so forth. And if you have a piece of news, then the system checks and ranks, whether what pieces of information that you could go to claim rank and fact check and so on. So this is the work of a group of scientists at the Qatar Computing Research Institute. And like you said, this now in the age of social media, this thing is turbocharged. So unfortunately, fake news is more sensational than real news, and therefore it travels much, much faster. In fact, it travels 6 times faster based on some research that was published in Nature by some folks at MIT. So, and what makes things worse is that most people, and 70-75% of people, can distinguish between right news and fake news. It's just not so trivial many times to discover the two. So right now, with what you said, with being turbocharged, the thing that's different from what Alan had said and so on, is that the scale is different. So information, the scale is so much higher, and the information is much more personalized. So now you can easily personalize the news, and this is this is easier now for many, many reasons. And the example of Cambridge Analytica and stealing 87 million users' information, including location profile and all kinds of demographics and personal information. You take this, and now you can weaponize this news. You literally, you can target the news, and you can weaponize it. It leads to many serious consequences, like we've seen in the Qatar news agency deal of fake news that led to the blockade eventually, that sort of culminated into the blockade. So this is it's a number of things. And if I can, I just wanted to touch base for 1 second. You said something about how old it is. So I looked up the oldest example of fake news that I can think of, and it's a story in the Quran. It's in
the Quran?
Yeah, I mean it's a biblical story.
You get gold points for that.
Well, it's a biblical story of Adam, the Prophet Adam, peace be upon him, and it says, هل أدلكم على شجرة الخلد وملك لا يبلى. That is sort of like the fake news that came from Iblis, from Shaitan. The biblical story goes, as the biblical story goes, trying to entice him to go to the tree,
right?
And all the consequences that came from it. And this was based on it's a lie. It's a fake. It's implanting fake news, and there are many examples that are as old as
I don't even
humanity.
know what to do with that, but thank you.
Don't.
I'm not going to go near that.
Yeah, so we don't get in trouble. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for going in trouble. But Michael, let me ask you, on this broad side, the reason I like the concept of truth decay and what you put on the table is it really talks about kind of an ecosystem that's out there, and some parts of the ecosystem become unhealthy, some parts of it are trying to balance that out. But I remember, there's a now late, but a former famous speechwriter and New York Times columnist, William Safire. He wrote a great historical novel once called The Scandalmongers. And in this book, it was really about early American history and the scandal sheets, who were the early bloggers of America, who would be hired essentially to write flaming, disparaging comments about Hamilton or Jefferson or Madison. And these scandal sheets really proliferated and were the sort of dominant rage of that time. And then eventually we worked through it. And I'm wondering whether those sorts of historical parallels appeal to you anyway as you think about the ecosystem of truth today. And do you see any prospect that we may get some self-correcting behaviors in the process?
Well, one of the questions we examine in the book is whether this period is unique. How does it compare to earlier periods? There are several periods, at least in American history, that are quite similar. You mentioned one in the end of the 19th century.
Right.
The period of so-called yellow journalism, mass-produced newspapers, sensationalized stories. Another period was the 1920s and 1930s, really when radio came into its own. Sensationalized stories, so-called, that was the jazz journalism era. Then you had the 60s and 70s.
When did War of the Worlds on the radio happen? Was that in the 30s?
I think in the...
So that was that came off as
in
fake
the 30s,
news, right?
But even earlier, there were instances of sensationalized stories about violence and so on. 1960s, some similarities in the Vietnam era with the declining trust in institutions. But no period has all four of the trends that we see in the last, developing in the last 20 years of the United States, in our judgment. And that makes this period, I think, different. And also more dangerous. The other thing that's different about today is the stakes are so much higher. If you make a mistake now about the danger of a contagion, it can spread around the world rapidly. That wasn't the case in any of the earlier periods. If you misjudge the lethality and seriousness of an enemy threat, the consequences are much more severe today than it was in earlier times. I thought I'd just make one comment on Alain's. We were talking earlier. I'm starting from the premise in the book that the more complicated, the more serious, and the more consequential decision is, the more you want to base that decision on the best available information. There are different kinds of information. Facts, one kind of information. Opinions are relevant, but it's different. Opinion different. A point of view or perspective has to be taken into account when evaluating an opinion. I think the concern that we've had is that there's less and less search for, interest in, and reliance on facts as a starting point for making a decision. There's virtually no complex decision that you can make based entirely on what's known, because there are uncertainties and so on. But it seems to me we ought to expect public officials to begin with the facts.
Nick, how do you see that? I mean, you come from another part of the world, but it's also sort of a Western democracy, and I've been, thinking about the decline in the trust in science, for instance, which I find bizarre. Or we've also, on the other side of it, despite science, Thomas Kuhn wrote, the structure of scientific revolutions is, these social and scientific constructs kind of work until they don't, and then they collapse en masse, and we've seen those theoretical constructs collapse in the past. But I'm just sort of interested in whether or not you think there are ways to deal with what Michael just shared, this really collapse of trust in institutions and things when facts are being abandoned. What would be your recipe for increasing a more healthy infrastructure of truth, if you will?
Well, a big piece of it is really coming to terms with the consequences, as Michael was saying, of, holding a false belief. And so there are many examples of that. Simply, if I have the belief that I can fly and I step off the side of a building, I'm, quickly going to find out that I can't. So there's a certain amount of leeway in terms of sort of interpretations and so on we might have, but there's basically brute reality underlying all of these beliefs that we have, and that's where the sort of bottom line is. So a key part of the problem is for people to really come to terms with the limits of, how far we can, what's the grey area like? So, I mean, I think one thing that I wanted to say, partly also going back to your question earlier, was really that over time, we're raising this question of whether things have, whether we've always had problems with truth and with, falsehood and misinformation and this kind of thing. I think, this fantastic work by Michael and others on how the context has changed is really important. But one key piece of the context that hasn't changed is human cognition, is our habits of how we receive information and what we do with it.
Right.
And so we're terribly biased in the way we think. We're really quite poor at sort of doing rational thinking, and this is something that's well understood by psychologists. So one of the things that I would, really recommend would be for people to come to learn much more about that, about our own cognitive biases, about our own problems in dealing with information, and actually create a form of literacy in the population.
So let me challenge you on that, because I've read some of your writing and work on this, and you kind of dismiss Ahmed's world of like using computer algorithms to solve this problem, right? You think that that's just, pushing the problem to someone else, and it really ought to be with people and training them better on critical thinking. And I'm just wondering if you're just really Pollyannish here, like, let's put it all on, my point was, given what you just said about human character, is that humans are, and Alan Gresh has said this as well, they can be played easily by sinister people who can play them like a piano because of these cognitive biases that they, and you're wanting them to change their nature and have less cognitive biases. Am I incorrect?
Well, in part, I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to dismiss the wonderful work that's going on with fact-checking.
Oh, come
and so
on, dismiss it.
I mean, my point about that work is that it is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So you can't, just by doing fact-checking, we've seen this. We see in the media the reports of, the wonderful websites that fact-check, President Trump's statements, and there are literally thousands of
my friend
statements there.
Glenn Kessler runs the Pinocchio page.
Right. Okay.
How you get 4 Pinocchios. He's come up with a new category for President Trump and any other president, not just the president, called the bottomless Pinocchio, which means...
Well, we've seen there that, even when you say this is false, you will get a reaction from supporters, which is, yeah, maybe it's false, maybe not, but I like it. And that would be, a key, that would be something related to probably what we call the confirmation bias, which is that we look for evidence that supports beliefs we already have. And so it's crucial to, if you want to know the truth, and if you're disposed to balancing, weighing up the options, then yeah, you really need to go to the fact-checking sites that you trust. But if you have this great diversity, and this is potentially the downside of the great diversity, is that when people are sort of, falling prey to their own biases, they just go to the source that they like, which is to say, they'll reject this kind of rating, which says this is not a trustworthy website. And that's the cultural part that I think we really
But you're
have to
presuming
change.
people want to know, and I go back to Alan as a publisher, who's been in the publishing field for a long time. If you wanted to get really mind-stretching, thoughtful commentary that might be irreverent and challenge official wisdom, you go to Le Monde Diplomatique. But if you were like most people, you would want to go to the local tabloid and see who was having sex with whom, right? Or whether it was true or not. And so the mass market doesn't exist with people who want to be thoughtful and sort through the news. I don't feel, but Alan, tell me where I'm wrong.
I think
Just Alan, you were, okay.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
I think one thing we should tackle is the relation of media with money. I mean, when we speak about Facebook and the way they are running, I mean, they have a very, very important responsibility, and they don't care because they want to make money. They are not. I mean, for example, we learned recently that the Burmese government has used Facebook as a way to create the condition for expelling the Rohingya, the Muslim. Facebook is not, it's not a problem for them. And this is one of the evolution, I think, is that they should be public control, I know it's very controversial, on the media in general. I don't buy the fact that the media are they are private owners, they don't, and they must be independent from any public control. I think they should be public control. I mean, in France, it's very different from other people. At some time, we had independent newspaper. Now, no French newspaper is owned by journalists. It was the case in Le Monde. Now it's finished. I mean, it's private interest. And we have this private interest, and sometimes it's not political. As in Facebook, they are not interested in politics, but Facebook or Twitter, they are not interested in the consequence of the fact that they want to earn money. And I think this is should be in the hand of not the, unfortunately, not the US government, but perhaps the United Nations. It seems very utopia. I don't buy the fact that people are stupid and they don't understand anything. This is what some media think. But I think if the public, government, United Nations, etc., has a real policy about it, we can have a television or media which are at the same time popular and serious.
Ahmed, please.
I was just going to respond to what Nick was saying,
Yeah.
that the problem, in fact, I think is going to get much worse, because as we're learning how to deal with fake news through these simple mechanisms, and I'm calling them simple, even though they may be based on kinds of technology. Now we have this full-body deep fake. So I mean, now you don't have to read the story. Now you can actually see Steve give a speech in his own voice that is totally garbage that he never said. So it's going to be even harder and harder for the layman to distinguish,
Manipulated video.
manipulated videos is now, I mean, it's very much possible using artificial intelligence and using algorithms that I could basically take text, give it to an algorithm, and say, I want Nick to say this. And in fact, when you check the voice, it's exactly his, and so on. So it's very, very sophisticated systems. And another problem where I think this is going to get much worse is the fact that it's very easy to generate fake news and a lot of fake news. And it takes a while to decipher it, to identify it, to figure it out. So by that, it takes, let's say, a couple of days for somebody to say, okay, I mean, yeah, this is not good, and send that information. By then, you've got 100 other stories that have come out. So the problem is getting much, much worse, and unfortunately. And I think what Alan had said with the consequences is absolutely true. So the social media sites, as good as they want to be, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, and they make money by having traffic. And fake news generates much, much more traffic than real news. I mean, it's much more juicy.
So let me ask you all a question about something. Now, again, there are certain cultures, Australia, the United States, I don't know Qatar as well, but France, have a belief that free speech is vital to democracy, vital to the civil rights and to civil society and the health of that. There are limits, and we negotiate those limits through the courts and whatnot. But I'm just wondering, in an age where, I've talked to Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, about this. Now, if you sit down with Jack, he looked quite pained when I had dinner with him about Alex Jones. Alex Jones is one of the great promulgators of lies and mistruths and sensational conspiracy theories that Donald Trump sort of loves. But he eventually got banned from Twitter. But before that, Dorsey was being roasted by everyone for allowing this in there. But he believes in free speech. And so that the standard for removing or disrupting or ending. So there's a battle of principles that are going on inside these firms. And it raises the interesting question to me about whether speech as we've known it can continue even in US society, whether we're asking for much greater regulation of speech than we've ever had before. And I think it raises interesting questions about, because right now society, and much of society is saying on some of these issues, we want regulation, we want the government to step in, or we want authorities to step in ways they haven't before. And I look at that as, wow, that might erode this world of free speech that we've had before. But your
Yeah,
thoughts on
no,
that?
I was just going to say because I don't want to sound as if I am attacking these. Twitter had
Yeah.
removed 70 million accounts in
Right.
May and June alone.
Right.
And they're being much more aggressive, and I think they're responding.
And it killed their stock price. Like
But-
it went,
but-
it just, as a stockholder in Twitter, it just,
But you know,
good for the world, bad for a guy who wanted to make money off Twitter.
that's right. Because I believe these people are very smart people, so they realize that the trend, and we've seen signs of this in Europe, that there will be penalties. There will be, in fact, there will be specific penalties, specific dollar amounts for not taking fake news out within a certain period of time if it was reported as such. So they know that legislation and legal and so on is coming. So that raising awareness and doing all those good things can only go so far. And it's just something at the end, like Alan had said, and Mike, that authorities, or I don't like to use the word government,
Right.
They tend to have a way of complicating things when you add legislation and so on and so forth. It just becomes much more complicated. There's got to be something done that's punitive to
Right.
make sure that this is taken seriously.
Michael?
Well, I think you said earlier, Steve, that this is an ecosystem, and I think that's sort of a key observation here. This is a complicated problem. It's taken a long time to develop, and there's not going to be a simple one-dimensional solution. Much of what we've talked about has focused on the way that information is provided, disseminated, and there's going to have to be changes in the way that that is done. It's not going to be enough.
But in your book, you do recommend some things that could be done to improve
and we're
that
working on
ecosystem.
more. We don't
Yeah.
have the, but we're committed to finding more of the answer. But I think there's also going to have to be attention on the other side of the transaction, which is the consumption, the consumer of. Despite the enormous changes in the information landscape, there haven't been hardly any changes in the way that we educate and train people to seek, use, evaluate information. So people aren't taught any differently in general about the distinction between facts and opinion, about distinguishing sound data from misleading data, and so on. And that's going to, I think, be a big part of the response and the solution to this problem. We're going to have to attack both the side
Alan,
of information providers as well as the consumer.
Alan, I want you to give your thoughts, but let me ask you an additional question I'd love you to answer as well, because I know you know the Middle East so well. I don't want to classify it because it's also true in Oklahoma, where I'm from. People love conspiracy theories, but part of the currency of information and whatnot in certain parts of the Middle East are conspiracy theories. It's just they grow like wildfire. I'm interested in whether we have any examples in the Middle East that you know of steps that were taken by the ecosystem or by society that actually began to roll that back. Were there things in terms of training people or thinking or talking about this in such a way where rolling back the prevalence of conspiracy theories as communication worked?
Unfortunately, no. For one reason, which is very simple, that there is no democracy. I mean, if you have no pluralism and no way to discuss, you cannot discuss even false news because people don't believe in any case. And the government is deciding what is true and what is false, and impossible to discuss. I have been following Egypt in 2011, 2012, etc. People were surprised that there were very extremist positions which were on the media, Salafist extremist positions. But for the first time, they were challenged. There was a discussion. So I think a part of the discussion should be that the condition of any changes mean that we accept pluralism and we accept debate. If we refuse this, it's very difficult after to challenge, and you get to some absurd things like you have today in Egyptian media saying that yellow vests in France were Muslim brothers. The Muslim brothers were behind this. And you cannot, it's so stupid. You don't know what to say. It's not... but I want to add something. Among the four reasons of decay, there is the distrust of journalists. And we should think as journalists, why? Why people... In France now, the 70% of the people don't believe journalists. And we must, I mean, I can develop on it, but I will only give one example which explained for me this. In 2005, we have a constitutional referendum about European Union, which was put by the government, which was supported by 90% of the media. It lost by 45% against 55%, meaning that 55% of the people felt that the media were not reflecting at all their point of view. And this is also a problem. I'm not saying that the media must be, I mean, you have 30% people right-wing, 20% left-wing, it must be the same. But if the media are so disconnected with what's happening in the society, and I think there are many reasons for this, it's also a problem.
Nick, do you have, in your analysis, have you looked at other possibilities of how to communicate and to create in this ecosystem of using scores or reputational scoring, you know, when people are coming in and saying thumbs up or thumbs down, where there are ways that, you know, engage those readers and other diverse sets of players out there, whether there might be bank shots that we hadn't thought of that might help create a much more organic and bottom-up way of ranking what seems true and what seems false.
Yeah, well, there's a project in Australia called the Socratic Web, which is run by...
Socratic Web?
Socratic Web, yeah. And so, I mean, that the idea there being that we learn from discourse questioning things and so on. And the guy who's running this, it's a sort of startup, his name's Shane Greenup, he was arguing for a type of ranking or a type of tagging which didn't say this is true or this is false, but it said this story has been contested. So not saying what you're reading is sort of known to be false or not, but there's someone else on the internet somewhere has, you know, taken issue with this particular story. So, you know, his argument there was to say, you know, don't try to tell people what's true or what's not, but try to draw their attention to a disputation or a sort of a disagreement over something, to draw their attention to the idea and, of course, give them the link.
It sounds like that you and Alan and Ahmed, maybe Michael, might be able to coalesce around the notion that when you have contending journalists or contending journalism, that over time you have a Darwinian effect. The bad ones die out, the good ones get rewarded.
Well, that would be the kind of classic view of you know, a strong sort of free speech idea, right? Is that the best ideas will win out in a kind of an economy. And I think that, you know, that is idealistic, but I still think it's kind of right. But in order for it to work, you really have to have the people in the population actually considering the different points of view and weighing them up rather than getting, you know, into a bubble and that sort of thing. So from my point of view, you know, the utopian vision would be that, you know, following what Michael was saying about really getting into people's heads a bit and saying, okay, you're the consumers here, you've got to sort of think about your habits, is really to promote values around consumption of information, not just training people, but really promoting that value of weighing things up and deciding on the best, you know, on the best outcome. So if that would argue for individuals being the ultimate regulators. So if you know, you were asking about regulation, and if you know, you can get wonderful responses from Twitter, but people are just going to go somewhere else. You know, the conspiracy theorists are just going to go somewhere else. And if you can change people's consumption habits, you can...
I hope we've got some good questions and comments in the audience, because we're going to go to you in just a minute. But let me just ask you this. I hear what you're saying, and I want to come back to Michael, who helped outline this. I almost know what his answer is going to be. But you know, people... You know, I often wonder, where are we today? Gravity and social forces and the way we're wired has taken us into this place. I have to tell you, my family's from Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and 100. I have a lot of second and third cousins. They used to have huge families. 97 of my 100 second cousins voted for Donald Trump. And they live in a very different world of gravity than, say, I do. Not that I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I'm not going to say what I did. But they're just in a different place than three others. And so, and I just, you know, I'm an MSNBC contributor, and there are very few MSNBC contributors with that family profile. And when you look at that, you realize that a man named Eli Pariser wrote a book called The Filter Bubble, in which people are surrounded by things that affirm what they already think. If they buy books on on Amazon. They know what the next second, third, fourth, or fifth will be on both the left and the right. And there are very few people, as a percentage basis, that are basically cross-pollinating across these views. And so people already doing what you're saying have created this thing where we have people living in completely different worlds. Gravity operates differently. You can look at the same event and people see it differently. So I just want to ask you just a simple question. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that we're going to sort this out? Michael?
Well, I don't think it's going to self-correct. I don't think the situation is going to self-correct. But in the end, I think there's some reason for optimism, and it's the reason why
A big reason or a little reason?
Well, I think it's a big reason in my mind, because one of the reasons I came up with another term other than post-truth era or post-fact era is I actually don't think we're in that. In the other walks of life that I'm familiar with, the military, for example, philanthropy, healthcare, the things that Rand works on where I work, the trend is moving in exactly the other direction. The quest for data, more sophisticated analytical methods has intensified over the last 20 years. It's only in this one slice of life, a very important one, public life, essentially, that the trend seems to be moving in the other direction. So I think one of the
data will save us, AI will save us.
Well, I mean, all of those things come with downsides that have to be anticipated and managed and so on. So most technological advances are not sort of unblemished pluses. They're both positives and negatives. But the trends, I think, from my perspective, are different in other parts of society. And the challenge, I think, for leaders in every sector is to harness what's been learned by developments in those parts of life and turn them in favor of an attack on this problem that we call truth decay. So that's my reason for optimism, is that the trends are going in different directions in other parts of society.
Thank you. Elaine? I can tell you had a slightly different view.
No,
You know, when you smile, I can tell that's the moment you're going to take Michael on.
no,
Yeah.
not at all. No, I think it's. I don't like the question itself. I mean, to be optimist or pessimist. I don't think we can.
Sorry.
No.
Yeah.
I don't think we can see what the future is. I mean, it's very, very difficult. There are many trends.
What I'm really saying, if I may, is does gravity solve the problem? Do the forces we have take us to solve the problem? Or do you think there needs to be, as Michael said, you know, prescriptive, you know, strategies to deal with it?
I think it depends on us. I mean, it's not written anywhere that it will go on this direction. It depends on what we do. I mean, at different level. So I'm optimistic in this sense that I think we can change it, and it's not ineluctable to go to catastrophe in the media. We can change things, and we can think about how we can change it. But we can. I am optimistic this way. I think we can change things.
Ahmed?
Look, the problem is this. The majority of the people that rely on traditional media, TVs and print press are dying. I mean, it's just older generation. So if you look at all the people here, and we have a lot of young people, thank you for coming, and you ask them where they get their news from, most likely they get it somewhere on social media or from
Instagram.
You know, or like my children from Instagram, or maybe from news websites and so on. And all of these things are prone to bias, are prone to, like we said before, echo chambers, because it's just people live in a bubble, and these bubbles grow, and I believe, to answer your question, is whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I think we are going to need some fundamental changes in the way that social media or electronic news is managed and organized. And I don't know where that's coming from, where that's going to come from, whether it's going to come from people are getting sick and tired of this and marching, like what Nick had said, and demanding something better because we deserve better, or technology is going to have to change, but I don't see the solution in the horizon. I think I see it as getting worse, because let's face it. I mean, if you are pro like you brought up the Trump example, I didn't, but if you're pro-Trump, you're unlikely to accept any negative news on Trump and vice versa. And then if you're a liberal, then you're less, you know what I mean? And everybody is so darn...
Wired.
You know, yeah. So I just don't see the solution. I believe the solution is going to come from the next generation, because now, whereas among my generation, 20% of the people perhaps get their news from social media and online. The younger generation, I believe, is totally online, and they've got to demand something better, because we deserve something better.
Right, Nick?
Well, I think, you know, to bring it back to what I've been sort of emphasizing all the way along, that human cognition plays an important role here. I think that the nature of human cognition gives us reasons to be pessimistic and reasons to be optimistic. So on the pessimistic side, you know, essentially the idea that we've now learned is that human cognition has essentially two systems that interact, and one of those systems is very, you know, biased and instinctive and emotive and so forth, and that's the one that gets exploited by all of the fake news and so forth. But the other type of system is the one that can kick in a conscious way that we can use for rational thought. And so my reason to be optimistic is that is something that people can do, that we're actually capable of learning how to use that second system when it's needed, learning how to recognize when the first system is you know, being played and so forth. So my reason to be optimistic would be that you know, we have that capacity. The real problem is the cultural problem of how to lead people to do that.
This has been a very robust discussion. We're going to go to all of you in a moment. I think I'd just add real quickly, a lot of things I would have loved to go down to the rabbit hole. We need a part 2 and a part 3 of this conversation, so come back on Monday and Wednesday, and you know, maybe we'll have this. But you know, a couple of things that come to mind. I recently interviewed the minister, the High Commissioner for the Single Digital Market or whatever in Europe. And we were talking about their regulation of privacy, which is also another way to also look at regulation of, you know, certain elements of speech and communication. And I asked him if Europe would ever, in this environment, give birth to a Facebook or a Google or something like that. And he very bluntly said no. He says, you Americans have to innovate and create those things. We have to regulate. And it was a very interesting way to look at the ecosystem there. Of how this is, because we can think about regulatory thickets that might grow, but then we have to ask, what is the future like if you stifle innovation and creation? Because I think a lot of people see benefit in the social media environment that's evolving. The other thing we didn't really get at, that I'll just throw on the table in case anybody hits us for not doing it, is that there are societies, like we haven't discussed China and what's happening with social media and social control, you know, where you now have facial recognition and you've got AI and machine learning that's machine learning about people and their crosswalking habits and connecting it to social standing and creating consequences for people. And so there's another side, a really dark side potentially, to some of the digital existence that we all have and the communications we have, which would be another great thing. But let me go to all of you in questions to Mark. It's right here in the third row, and we'll come up then to the front. And we have a mic coming over to you.
Okay, so it seems that journalists are often at a crossroads when it comes to how information is presented. They must consider accurate reporting and making sure consumers are presented with an attention-grabbing title, picture, or summary in order to boost or maintain traffic. What are journalists and newspapers doing in order to combat clickbait? And how do they restore confidence in traditional journalism?
Yeah, this is a great question, or if I would give it a headline, how can journalists get back to being boring rather than sensationalists, right? Is that fair? Yeah, I mean, we hadn't really talked. Alan, you know, this is your business. Are you a clickbaiter?
I don't know. No, I think I think first, the situation is different in different countries. I mean, second, it's not linked with the journalist individually. It's linked with the media system. When the media system is working in one way, it's very difficult to a journalist alone to come and change everything. You can do it, I mean, a little with internet because you can create media, etc., but it's very limited. One of the things in France, I think, which is important, is to change who are the journalists. I mean, to be journalist in France, you must make one high school which called Sciences Po, 4 years after your baccalaureate, and then 3 years school of journalists, meaning that the people who will be journalists are coming from a little place from Paris. I mean, center of Paris, a high middle class with money, which make them. I mean, it's not important that they are right wing or left wing. It's the same social profile. I think this is a problem. When there was trouble in the suburbs in 2005, you know, there were suburbs very fights with police, etc. I met journalists, young journalists. Really, they were more afraid to go in these suburbs than to go to Afghanistan. And they didn't know anything. They have fixer to go in these suburbs, making how they are disconnected from a part of the society. And I think it's not the only problem, but it is one of the problems.
Any thought, real quick, Nick?
Yeah, real quick. Just, you know, the big problem, of course, is that in the media, you know, you've got this this tension. You know, you're trying to draw attention to your work, whether it's because you have an employer who's making money, or whether it's because, you know, you're trying to get through to people. That if something's clickbaity, one of the things about it is that it'll draw people's attention, and attention is, you know, this is an attention economy. I would just draw attention to, for example, this project, the correspondent in the Netherlands. Rob Weinberg is the guy's name, and so his motto is something like from sensational to foundational, I think, and his whole sort of philosophy is to get away from sensational news and get to foundational news, and not, you know, get away from breaking news. And so you might be interested to look at that project.
There's it right up here in the front, and then we'll work our way to the back. And yeah, we've got lots of questions. Let's go really fast, and we'll gather a couple. I just want to say response too, because, you know, I'm of the Atlantic, and this, that I would be careful of thinking that all journalism is that way. My experience is that it's become so diverse, that the behaviors are so diverse. We have Ben Smith is the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, is one of the media partners I ran into here. And you could argue that, you know, Buzz does some of these things, but some of Ben's best things don't do that at all. And there's an ecosystem. And I can tell you that in my work, my most, I won't call them boring, but my most wonky and least clickbaiting items have been the ones that have been the most read, the most shared, and most. So there are counter trends and whatnot in the system. So I understand what you're saying, but I think that the community wants a diverse set of options. But let's go fast. Yes.
Thank you to all the panelists. So one of the things which has coincided with the phenomenon which we've discussed today is increasing polarization in many societies, especially the United States, where our political divide is fundamentally urban-rural. So given that there's increasing polarization, as Professor Enfield has mentioned, people have confirmation bias and are more likely to select sources that align with the ideas they previously held. Could it simply be that the phenomenon is fundamentally about social polarization, which might have a lot of other causes, like concentration of economic activity in cities, cultural change, and that this is simply a manifestation of a deeper problem rather than something which is fundamentally causative of social instability?
Great. And we only have 3 minutes, so I'm going to jump to this gentleman right here. Let's take his comment, and then we'll respond to everybody. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. My name is Amit Bharwa. I'm a journalist from India. Just a couple of brief points I want to make.
We have like 30 seconds.
One is that WhatsApp wasn't considered at all. And WhatsApp in our societies, it's not journalists who are creating this content. It could be political parties, it could be right-wing groups, anybody. Right. So that's just one small thing. The other thing which I just wanted to bring attention to is that let's take George W. Bush and the nuclear bomb in Iraq. Here is a case of a world leader telling the world something which is completely untrue. And it was found that it was untrue, but a country went to war. The consequences are for there to everyone to see. So extrapolating from that, what do journalists and media groups especially, because owners control the media, not just journalists. So what do they do when they know that political leaders are lying through their teeth, especially in election campaigns?
Thank you.
And the other thing,
I don't have time.
On that same issue.
Yeah, we don't have time.
How is it that when the media, especially the American media, reported that falsehood day in and day out, and it came to be true, what are the responsibilities of the media itself to fact check stuff?
Thank you very much. We will respond to those two. One, polarization. I apologize to many other questions that were up there, but on polarization and also the broad question of, we had, not just in this era, but the very appropriate reference to President Bush and the other eras. But what are the broad, you're asking what are the normative and moral, responses of journalists. I would say as a journalist who was there, I wrote a lot about how bad that was, but, it's a competitive marketplace. But final thoughts, Michael.
Well, there are four causes of truth decay. One of them is polarization, not just political polarization, but social and economic polarization that allows echo chambers to form and to persist.
Yeah.
The only final comment I'd make, Steve, is that this is a very serious, almost existential problem in my view, because truth decay erodes civil discourse, which leads to dysfunction, gridlock, which reduces trust in public institutions even further. That leads to disengagement of citizens from democratic processes. Hard to see how a democracy can remain healthy with that trend.
Great. Alan, let me ask you to respond to the gentleman's second question about the responsibilities of journalists when facing, essentially official lies.
Of course, it's very important, but we know that Washington Post and New York Times had made a self-criticism after 2001 and the question of mass destruction, arm, etc. I cannot answer. We have a responsibility, but also it's linked. In France, we were more independent, but also because the French position, the French official position was different. When in 1991, France decided to go to war in Iraq, at that time, Le Monde Diplomatique was against this idea, but we were very isolated. And also we have the situation, especially in question of foreign relations, the newspapers are taking the side of mostly of their government, unfortunately.
Ahmed, quick thought?
I was just going to make a quick comment that I don't think it's fair to say that the U.S. society is becoming more polarized. I believe that the whole world is becoming more polarized. And we see many, many instances of that in Europe, for example, and in societies that traditionally have been very socially aware and so on and so forth, without naming specific countries. So I think this is a global problem. It's not a problem of the U.S. alone.
Nicholas, final word?
Yeah, I think that, with the polarization thing, the one thing I want to say is that I feel like language, the properties of language really play a huge role in this. And one of the interesting things about language is that it simultaneously gives you information and tells you something about who I am. And so the problem is that these two things can get confused, or the priority of one can outrank the other. This is an existential problem of the kind Michael said, because the information that language gives feeds into your decisions. It gives you reasons for action. So if I'm just saying something in order to align with the group that I align with, then I'm basically, the ultimate cost of that is that words come to mean nothing, and the currency that we call language can collapse.
I'm sure there's much we didn't get to. This is the deepest, most deep dive that I've seen on the subject so far, and really is surprisingly good. I was expecting something much worse, Michael. So I would just simply say, where can people? I know you have an Arabic version of this out. You have an English. Is there an easy way they can download or acquire this book?
Yeah, you can buy it on Amazon, but I'd recommend you download it for free from the RAND website.
You can download it for free.
For free, and like
RAND
all
website.
the RAND products. But
in Arabic from free?
In Arabic, yeah, or English. But if you want a hard copy, I'm old-fashioned, I like the hard copy, just tell me and I'll send you one.
Yeah, and do you get residuals from how well this is selling?
I do not.
Okay, with that. So I want to please give our panel a big round of applause. Thank you very much. Nicholas Enfield, Ahmed El Magaramed, Alan Gresh, and Michael Rich. Thank you very, very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all of you.